The Crescent Moon Club, in association with Cyclops Entertainment, presents Omnibus Unlimited, a roundtable discussion program of provocative issues which must be addressed today. Radiovision for the 21st century. A chalkboard for the revisionist. 10 fingers to a higher understanding. A planner's kit for then and beyond. Hello everybody, I'm John Horrigan, producer and creator of Omnibus Unlimited and president of the Crescent Moon Club. Tonight a very special episode. Tonight the episode is on remote viewing and scanning. From Out There by Howard Blum, Pocket Star Books, Chapter 1. There are 7,087 man-made objects in space. They include 10 screws, each an eighth of an inch in diameter, that were discarded during the 1984 shuttle mission. A thermal glove that floated out of Gemini 4 in 1965, a screwdriver dropped by a careless spacewalking cosmonaut aboard the Soviet Mir space station, and several thousand satellites, some actively communicating with ground stations, and some relics, useless 20th century antiques that will continue to whiz and clank through space for generations to come. As coincidence would have it, the DIA's Directorate for Management and Operations had originally decided to launch its Project Aquarius because of a series of incidents that also had occurred in a windowless room. Only the site for these events had been nowhere near the snow-capped peak of Cheyenne Mountain, but rather thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., in a lead-lined conference hall on the third floor of the ornate old executive office building directly across from the White House. The vault, belonging to George Keyworth, the President's science advisor, was already filled with Office of Science and Technology staff on that day in the fall of 1985. An eager opening night crowd, one who shared the experience, recalled when the two Stanford Research Institute, SRI, scientists had announced that they were ready to proceed. Seated at a small table at the front of the room was a man that scientists identified only as their viewer. He was smiling expansively as the older scientist, a big, beefy sort with a sergeant major's bellow to his voice, offered a brief introduction. What we will demonstrate, the scientist promised, is the existence of a new perceptual channel through which certain individuals are able to perceive and describe remote data not presented to any known sense. This new channel is related, we believe, to the phenomenon known as remote viewing. The difference is, and at this point at least one listener thought the scientist sounded somewhat uneasy, as if he too had a hard time believing all these extraordinary claims, that while remote viewing requires the viewer to focus his mind's eye on a specific individual, this new channel is employed by focusing on specific latitudinal and longitudinal information. The scientist then announced, "Okay, Commander, we're ready to begin." A voice from the back of the dark room, loud and authoritative, proceeded to read off a short series of precise geographical coordinates. The scientist, archly polite, now asked his viewer to be so kind as to repeat aloud each of the specific coordinates. The viewer did so without hesitation, which seemed to be some sort of a feat in itself. Then, without another instruction, the viewer became, in an instant, wrapped up in a trance. Minutes passed. The viewer's head was bowed. It nearly touched the table. The silence in the room was intense. At last he raised his head and spoke softly. "I see a house, big, a mansion actually, with pillars." When the viewer's words trailed off, the SRI scientist suggested he draw what he had seen. The viewer looked into the distance for a moment before he picked up his pencil and started to sketch, working quickly and fluidly, like an action painter. He began with geometric forms, rectangles and squares mostly, and bit by bit a pattern emerged. While he worked, the room was hushed. The only sound was his sharp pencil scratching rapidly across a thick pad of paper. Then, all at once, he put his pencil down. He sat with his hands folded in front of him. He reminded one observer of an obedient child awaiting his reward. "Perhaps you're finished," suggested the sergeant major scientist. But there was no answer, just a small, indecisive shrug. So finally, the scientist took the drawing and began to pass it around the room. He instructed everyone to take a good look, please. As the crude drawing moved from hand to hand, the other, more youthful-looking scientist motioned to the man in the naval officer's uniform who had been sitting impassively in the rear. It was all done without a word. The scientist, who wore rimless glasses and the longish blonde hair of a graduate student, had simply raised his hand as though he were hailing a cab. The officer rose, and when he walked to the front of the room, everyone could see the 3 gold commander's stripes on his sleeves and the black leather briefcase that was handcuffed to his wrist. The commander, later he would inform science and technology staff members that he was assigned to the Office of Naval Intelligence in Sweetland, Maryland, quickly unlatched the briefcase from his wrist. Without waiting to be asked, he searched through the case and withdrew a black and white photograph. He handed it to the older scientist, who gave the photograph little more than a glance, and then, very matter-of-factly, he passed it around the room. The pillared house in the photograph was identical in shape to the sketch that had just been drawn. "Please tell them about the photograph," the scientist, still cool, still detached, requested politely. The officer was laconic. It had been taken by satellite. He allowed a moment to pass until, as if gauging the building mood in the room, the commander, with perfect timing, coyly offered a small afterthought. "It's the country Dhaka of Mikhail Gorbachev." Only now did the 2 scientists show any emotion. They beamed at their viewer with the self-satisfied glee of trainers taking measure of their Derby winner. The heavy scientist, bursting with triumph, announced to the room, "And that, gentlemen, is how information is conveyed through the phenomenon we call scanate." The next phase, or second act, some office wags later joked, for it was all by design, no doubt, quite theatrical, of the demonstration centered on the possible use of psychic powers in anti-submarine warfare. Here again, the commander played the role of the sorcerer's apprentice, though now, clearly part of the show, he was no longer required to assume his bleacher seat. He remained standing at the front of the room, wedged between the 2 SRI scientists. The viewer, as before, was still seated at a small table. He was still smiling amicably at the audience. He might have been an attentive host, hoping all of his guests were having a good time. The experiment began when the commander reached into his briefcase and this time withdrew a stack of photographs. Like a man dealing a hand of solitaire, he laid them out one at a time into 2 short rows directly in front of the viewer. The photographs, perhaps there were about 6, were face up, some in color, some black and white. All were photographs of submarines, American and Soviet, both attack class and larger boats armed with land-bound MIRV nuclear warheads. Reader's note: at this recording in 1994, within the past 3 years, there have been 3 collisions between Soviet and American nuclear submarines on the east coast of the Soviet Union. "I'd like you, please, to study these photographs," the older scientist told the viewer. A further instruction, this time emphasizing each syllable in the word, followed carefully. The viewer obeyed. He began at the top row and worked left to right. He stared conscientiously, bending his head low toward each photograph. After a while, he would place his right hand at the stern of the submarine and begin to trace the entire outline of the boat with all 5 fingers. He moved his hand very slowly, a fraction of an inch at a time. It was as if his fingers were running along the very steel of the boat, appreciating the variety of cold, hard sensations. It took some time, and all the while the scientist addressed the audience. He explained that the purpose of this demonstration was to show how scanate might be used to facilitate the detection of submarines. According to the scientist, the viewer, and he spoke as if the man were someplace else, which perhaps was true, so intense was his involvement with the photographs and his concentration, was at that moment scanning the globe. He was searching the world's oceans for the whereabouts of these submarines. When he sees one, the viewer will describe its location, the scientist explained. He will state the specific geographical coordinates of each site. And how will we know if our viewer is accurate? Well, the scientist asked. The commander, he quickly revealed, just happened to have in his briefcase a chart with the locations of each of these submarines as of 24 hours ago. There was some reaction from the room, and the scientist patiently waited for quiet before pulling the last rabbit from his hat. One other thing, just to make this experiment a little more interesting, I've added some controls. Not all of the submarines whose photographs are on this table are at sea. One is not even built. Another is in dry dock. Let's see if this throws our viewer off. Then, again rushing right into it, he turned to the viewer and asked, "Perhaps you would please tell me whether you can scan the submarine pictured in the top row left-hand corner." What was so remarkable, as one eyewitness would recall years later, was how the viewer seemed convinced his gift was unremarkable. They might have been asking if he knew the time for all he cared. That was the way this observer put it. Upon the scientist's command, the viewer would focus on a specific photograph for a beat, then another. When he was done, he would raise his head and zero in on some secret spot in his mind's eye, though as near as anyone present could tell, the place he was concentrating on was somewhere on the rear wall. His eyes would set on this target until at last he would begin a journey. His eyes traveled from some point at the top of the wall to another place where the wall met the floor. As he did this, his head would gently bob up and down as though he were reading columns of stock quotations in the Wall Street Journal. Perhaps he was scanning the globe. It was really never explained. He moved from one photograph to another without delay. He was very earnest, processing each assignment with an almost robotic efficiency. The sub in the first photograph, a U.S. Navy attack boat, he could not locate anywhere. This didn't seem to bother him or the scientist, so many of the spectators, by now believers, assumed this was one of the jokers the SRI team had put into the deck. And, as the viewer moved down the row of photographs, he appeared to be on a roll. One boat, according to the geographical coordinates he announced, was off the northern coast of Iceland. The next, a Soviet boomer, as subs with nuclear ballistic missiles are called, was at a latitude and longitude that put her in international waters not too far off the coast of South Carolina. Now, this shook some people up. But such uneasiness was only a prelude to what happened when the viewer went on to the fourth photograph, the one at the extreme left of the second row. At the start, the photograph of the Soviet Delta-class submarine seemed to present little challenge to the viewer. He went into his head-bobbing routine and, as usual, started to call out a set of coordinates. Then he stumbled. His face suddenly became twisted with the surprised look of someone who had just encountered a small but unexpected trouble in his path. The scientist caught this too, and he asked, "What is it?" The viewer thought for a moment. Was he deciding on an answer, an excuse, or the truth? Instead, when he was once more in control, his stride righted, he chose to announce the coordinates. The boat was patrolling a block of ocean between the Maine coast and Nova Scotia. Yet just as he began scanning for the next photograph, he stopped. His trance broke. All at once, he was back among the people in the crowded room, and he was clearly uncomfortable. No, one of the witnesses decided. He was downright scared. "What is it?" the scientist repeated, almost anxious. The viewer, now a little embarrassed, explained that he had seen something else while he was searching for the last boat. The coordinates were the same, only it was hovering above the submarine. Was it an airplane, the scientist suggested? The viewer groped for an answer. The best he could offer was a shrug. So the scientist, willing to let the experiment follow its own momentum, asked the viewer to draw, please, what he had just seen. The viewer agreed. Once he reclaimed his trance, he drew rapidly. Again, the sketch had a geometric quality about it. Circles predominated the sketch. Quickly, though, as he began to refine it to coincide with his vision, one large circle became narrowed, oblonged. Another circle perched on top of this larger shape was, with a line of his pencil, neatly halved. It was a drawing of a wingless aircraft. To many in the room, the drawing was quite familiar. A rocket, the scientist prodded after a long look at the sketch. The viewer heaved his shoulders, a reflexive gesture which could have meant possibly, or come off of it. The scientist returned to studying the drawing. He considered it quite conscientiously, and yet finally defeated, he had no choice but to blurt out what was on the mind of nearly everyone in the room. "Well, what else could it be? I mean, you're not going to tell me it's a flying saucer." "Yes," said the viewer. "That's exactly what it is." It was a credit to the scientific objectivity of the SRI team that the classified report on the demonstration in the old executive office building prepared for its primary client, the Defense Intelligence Agency, was very complete. True, it was only a footnote, but at the bottom of one page, in a note explaining how the percentage of accurate responses, that's 46%, was tabulated, there was a reference to an untabulated incident involving the sighting of what the authors of the report referred to as an unidentified flying object. And there were many, both in and out of Washington, who would also doubtlessly insist that it is to the credit of the DIA that the information contained in this footnote, however fantastic, did not diminish its enthusiasm for scanning. In fact, while Dr. Keyworth's aides were left with large, gnawing doubts after a contrived, if not prankish, demonstration, the DIA was undeterred. Within 6 months of the experiment in the vault room, the DIA, with the co-sponsorship of Naval Intelligence and unknown to the President's Office of Science and Technology, launched a classified operation that employed viewers to scan the globe for Soviet submarines. The operation was called, perhaps pregnantly, perhaps by luck of the computer draw, Project Aquarius. Over the next 14 months, there were at least 17 recorded sightings of hovering unidentified flying objects by the scanning participants in Project Aquarius. These sightings were well known to the men in the DIA's Directorate for Management and Operations who were supervising Project Aquarius. To some of these intelligence officers, it was ammunition for their cynicism, supporting evidence for their contention that using psychics to scan for submarines was a ludicrous, wasteful experiment. To others, it was a quickly dismissed statistic, a small, unexplained quirk in an exercise that, they were confident, would help to locate Soviet submarines. But to at least one M&O officer, these Aquarius sightings would become something more, an inspiration. Colonel Harold E. Phillips of the DIA was certain he had seen a UFO. According to the story he reportedly had no qualms about sharing with many fellow officers, it had happened nearly 40 years ago on a clear summer's night while walking through an Iowa cornfield with his father, and it had been impossible to forget. The vision of a dome-shaped ship, as big as a Greyhound bus and as bright as a Broadway marquee, had stayed with him for a lifetime. Ever since that wondrous moment, he told friends without embarrassment, he had been waiting for it to return. Every night, part wish, part reflex, he looked up at the dark sky, confident he would finally see it. It was incredible to think so, he knew, but as he told friends, he was also certain it would be the most natural thing in the world. His long wait haunted him, perplexed him, obsessed him, yet he never doubted that it would return. Each of the classified Aquarius sightings of hovering unidentified flying objects was, the colonel announced to DIA officials, more testimony to a larger and even more dazzling knowledge he had possessed since childhood. Something was out there. So when the report about the incident at Cheyenne Mountain crossed his desk in the Office of Management and Operations, he read it eagerly. Perhaps he wanted to believe the moment was at hand. They were about to announce themselves, yet as a day passed and still nothing happened, he grew dejected. Even more troubling, he decided, was his government's attitude. The President and the Joint Chiefs were allowing a confirmed sighting, and to the President and the Joint Chiefs were allowing a confirmed sighting. To the colonel's mind, there was never any doubt that the bogey monitored by Crystal Palace was anything else but an alien craft, to be filed away as just one more strange cosmic mystery. Such complacency ate away at Colonel Phillips. He was goaded by it until he had an idea. He was able to persuade the scientists running the Project Aquarius teams to conduct a new experiment. The precise latitude and longitude where the fence had first been tripped was provided to 3 of the most reliable Aquarius viewers. Reader's note earlier on in this book out there by Howard Blum, The Defenses of NORAD, at Crystal Palace, which is in Cheyenne Mountain, which has the most sophisticated and sensitive listening devices to monitor both the sea and air, is tripped by some unidentified flying object, and it causes the ranks to be shaken up in Cheyenne Mountain, and a briefing ends up on President Reagan's desk. Of course, strict controls were enforced. The viewers were placed in 3 separate isolation chambers. There was no way any one of them could have known what specific coordinates the others had received. Next, they were offered identical instructions. If you can scan for anything unusual at that location within the last 48 hours, well, then draw it. By the end of the day, 3 sketches were faxed to the colonel's office in the Pentagon. They were all crude, largely geometrical pencil drawings. Each was obviously the work of a different artist, but all 3 were quite similar. They were drawings of all rounded, wingless aircraft. The colonel put the drawings to good use. In that final winter of Ronald Reagan's final term, 1988, the DIA was persuaded the time had at last come to convene a top-secret working group to investigate the possibility that extraterrestrials were making contact with this planet, a possibility that for the past 4 decades the government had publicly and categorically insisted was impossible. So moving on, Colonel Phillips now goes to a top-secret compartmented meeting. He was now assistant to the DIA's representative to the National Foreign Intelligence Board's Committee on Imagery Requirements and Exploitation, which is called COMREX. It was one of the most sensitive and powerful jobs in the entire intelligence community. And COMREX determined the missions for the United States spy satellites. So anyways, he goes into a meeting, into the vault, and for the next 45 minutes, as a series of slides provided by the U.S. Space Surveillance Center clicked into focus, the colonel spoke without interruption. He gave the details of the mysterious Cheyenne Mountain alert and shared the history of Project Aquarius. When he reached the point in his narrative where he revealed the most recent experiment the Aquarius scientists had run, 3 sketches were flashed in rapid succession on the screen. They were the pencil drawings of the domed, wingless craft the viewers had scanned at the precise location where the fence had been tripped. Reader's note, so obviously now he goes back and has these remote viewers scan the area where they originally had the infraction of the United States radar limits, where it was compromised. It was at that moment that an Air Force general broke in. "That's like nothing we've got," he said. The colonel nodded his head in agreement and added, "Or the Russians. At least that we know about." Suddenly, an Army officer spoke up. He seemed annoyed, and his tone was, it would be recalled, loud and aggressive. He demanded to know if Colonel Phillips thought the object that had been monitored by the Space Command was an alien spacecraft. The colonel waited before answering. A white light shone intensely on the black screen. When at last he spoke, each word was articulated carefully, as though after much consideration. "Sir," he said, "I think we all have to agree that that's a distinct possibility here." The seminal CIA monograph, The Investigation of UFOs. It was an attractive point of embarkation because not only was it a comprehensive chronological survey, but it also was a genial read. Though graded secret at the time of its publication in 1961, the paper opened with a narrative charm suitable to a fairy tale. In 593 BC, Ezekiel recorded a whirlwind to the north which appeared as a fiery sphere. In 1254 at St. Albans Abbey, where the moon was 8 days old, there appeared in the sky a ship elegantly shaped, well-equipped, and of marvelous color. This stylish tone, however, turned abruptly feisty and judgmental as the story reached the modern era of UFOs. On June 24, 1947, the monograph continued, Kenneth Arnold, a fire equipment salesman piloting his own plane near Mount Rainier in Washington State, observed 9 luminescent objects flying at extraordinary speeds across the sky. Arnold, frightened and bewildered, described each of these odd vehicles as resembled a saucer skipping across the water. The wire services latched onto the story, and as so often is the case, an anonymous autocrat on the copy desk wielded a fateful red pencil. When the papers hit the newsstands that evening, the unknown craft had become flying saucers. A new epoch, the CIA proclaimed, had dawned. Or had it? for despite the CIA's self-assured pronouncement, perhaps that truly epochal event in the long history of the government's fascination with UFOs did not occur. I reasoned until 3 weeks later, on July 12, 1947, the commanding general of Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, received a written account from Kenneth Arnold asking for an explanation of these aircraft. The letter had the urgent feel of a telegram, since Arnold, in haste or for emphasis, took to omitting articles and conjunctions from his sentences. Still, it was undeniably earnest. It is to us a very serious concern, as we are very interested in the welfare of our country as you are. And it was resoundingly effective, because the commanding general of Wright Field started a file. Well, here's some additional commentary. I'm John Horrigan, producer of Omnibus Unlimited. Remote viewing, scanning, psychic ability. We've seen the people have psychic events where they know that one of their kin, their mother, their father, their brother and sister is in trouble. They just feel it. We've heard of women's intuition, which I think is a very accurate science. People with psychic abilities, enhanced mind capabilities. So you have this person or people that have the ability to look at a photograph by feeling it and announce where on Earth in the oceans it is at that time. And then you will also have on the opposite end, a viewer can be given coordinates and he'll sketch out what he sees at that coordinate of the globe, you know, with the latitude and longitude, and he'll sketch it out. As we saw, the viewer could sketch out, given the latitude and longitude, he'd sketch to Mikhail Gorbachev's summer home on the Black Sea. And then another time, the guy was given 6 photographs of subs. One was dry docked, one was obsolete and out of commission, 4 were operational, one being American. He scans them and gives locations, one off the coast of South Carolina, one going between Nova Scotia and Maine. And then he says there's a flying saucer hovering over one of the subs. And then he goes back and scans a little more, and I think it happens over a dozen times where he scans and he sees these discoidal ovoids that are hovering over our nuclear submarines. Now, I mentioned earlier in the program that Soviets and Americans submarines, boomers as they call them, the nuclear subs with warheads, they play cat and mouse, tag, hide and seek. They go into each other's top secret, classified, and restricted areas. And there have been 3 collisions over the past 3 years. There have been numerous incidents where nuclear submarines have had problems, faltered, and have plunged to the bottom of the oceans. Their nuclear reactors still operational and intact, and their nuclear warheads on board, ready to be detonated. So you look at these scanners now, and of course the Soviets were the first to really go after this psychic investigation, using psychics as a weapon, using psychics and people with phenomenal mental abilities to enhance their defense capabilities. So we have these guys, obviously top secret and very valuable to the government, that are scanning the oceans for submarines, and it can be a valuable tool. Now, you ask, if that's the possibility, then these people can probably, if they can find submarines, they can find people, right? So if you give them the longitude, what's going on at a specific longitude. For instance, I'm sure if they wanted to find out if we were building in North Korea, we'd just give them the longitude if this guy is still alive, and he can tell us what they've built at that site so far. And then if we're looking for a particular person, I guess you'd have to give a photograph of that particular person. Like if we were looking for Saddam Hussein, for instance, we would go to one of these remote viewers, these scanates, and see if they could locate where Saddam Hussein is. So there are a variety of applications for remote viewing, and I think it's time that the United States jumps into this area of psychic phenomena. And now the Majestic 12 documents. These are briefing documents, Operation Majestic 12, prepared for President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower, November 18, 1952. 42 years ago. Eyes only. Subject, Operation Majestic 12, preliminary briefing for the President. Operation Majestic 12 is a top-secret research and development intelligence operation responsible directly and only to the President of the United States. Operations of the project are carried out under control of the Majestic 12, Magic 12 group, which was established by special classified executive order of President Truman on September 24, 1947, upon recommendation by Dr. Vannevar Bush and Secretary James Forrestal. The members of the Majestic 12 group were designated as follows: Admiral Roscoe H. Hillenkoetter, Dr. Vannevar Bush, Secretary James V. Forrestal, General Nathan F. Twining, General Hoyt S. Vandenberg, General Dr. Detlef Bronk, Dr. Jerome Hunsaker, Mr. Sidney W. Sowers, Mr. Gordon Gray, Dr. Donald Menzel, General Robert M. Montague, and Dr. Lloyd V. Berkner. The death of Secretary Forrestal on May 22, 1949, created a vacancy which remained unfulfilled until August 1, 1950, upon which date General Walter B. Smith was designated as a permanent replacement. On June 24, 1947, a civilian pilot flying over the Cascade Mountains in the state of Washington observed 9 flying disc-shaped aircraft traveling in formation at a high rate of speed. Although this was not the first known sighting of such objects, it was the first to gain widespread attention in the public media. Hundreds of reports of sightings of similar objects followed. On July 7, 1947, a secret operation was begun to assure recovery of the wreckage of this object for scientific study. During the course of this operation, aerial reconnaissance discovered that 4 small human-like beings had apparently ejected from the craft at some point before it exploded. These had fallen to the earth about 2 miles east of the wreckage site, and all 4 were dead and badly decomposed due to action by predators and exposure to the elements during the approximately 1-week time period which had elapsed before their discovery. A specific scientific team took charge of removing these bodies for study. The wreckage of the craft was also removed to several different locations. Civilian and military witnesses in the area were debriefed, and now news reporters were given the effective cover story that the object had been a misguided weather research balloon. On December 6, 1950, a second object, probably of similar origin, impacted the Earth at high speed in the El Indio Guerrero area of Texas-Mexican border after following a long trajectory through the atmosphere. By the time a search team arrived, what remained of the object had been almost totally incinerated. Such material as could be recovered was transported to the AEC facility in Sandia, New Mexico, for study. Well, that concludes our show tonight, Omnibus Unlimited, on remote viewing and scanate, as they call it, or scanning. I'm John Horrigan, producer of Omnibus Unlimited. I'd like to thank you for watching tonight's show, and a reminder that Omnibus Unlimited is seen every night at this time.